Welcome, Packets and Bolts podcast about technology, life, philosophy, and everything in between. It is Tuesday, November 28th, 2023. This is your host, Muskrat, flying solo today as I interview James Corbett of the Corbett Report. Hope everyone out there had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know I did. No headlines or anything like that tonight, but I am sipping some hot sake. Tasty stuff. Yeah, it's one of those days. No mongoose, no dub stench. But James Corbett is probably one of the most interesting people I've ever had the pleasure of interviewing. For those not familiar, the CorbettReport.com, it's www.CorbettReport.com. That's 2 T's. Link will be in the description. I was, let's see, I think probably maybe 7 to 10 years ago was when I first found his content on YouTube, although as we'll get into, it's since been taken down from YouTube, which is one of the topics we cover. But we cover a lot of different things. We cover tech censorship, shadow banning, all of those kinds of things, geopolitical power structures. Very interesting interview that we'll be getting to in just a second here. For those that aren't familiar, the Corbett Report is an independent, listener-supported alternative news source. It operates on the principle of open source intelligence and provides podcasts, interviews, articles, and videos about breaking news and important issues from 9/11 truth and false flag terror to the Big Brother police state, eugenics, geopolitics, and central banking fraud, and more. This is definitely a must-listen-to interview, and we'll be getting to it coming up right now. All right, welcome James Corbett to the Packets and Bolts show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I've listened to you years ago, and I've always followed you mostly on your content on the false flag of 9/11, and with all the recent various bouts of censorship that seems to be going on these days, I decided to look you up and just see what you were up to on YouTube, where I came across the fact that you were basically a different channel that had re-uploaded your content, and then I think you had a farewell video saying you would never upload to YouTube again. And that's what prompted me to seek you out. I knew you were on other, media as well, but YouTube is just where I would catch you in that. Like I said, mostly from your 9/11 content. So I'm curious, what actually happened? Was it a thing where they just didn't tell you and you disappeared, or did they actually give you strikes, or what happened?
Yeah. Good question. And to answer that question, people can go to CorbettReport.com, just type mission accomplished into my search bar, and you'll find an article that I wrote shortly after getting banned on April 11th, 2021. Mission accomplished, the Corbett Report removed from YouTube, which was the sort of, in a nutshell, just takeaway from my banning from YouTube. But I guess to put this in the context it deserves. So it was 16 years ago that I started my YouTube channel, and at that time could not have possibly imagined that anyone around the world would be watching it, let alone hundreds of thousands. So by the time I got banned in April of 2021, I had going on 570,000 subscribers, 90 million plus video views, et cetera, et cetera. It was a pretty big channel. So why did it get banned? How did it get banned? What happened? I guess in a sense, the story goes back to 2001, because, as you intimate there, a lot of my work for the past 16 years is centered around the idea of false flags. And, of course, 9/11 was my very first topic that I ever covered on my first podcast, and something I've researched deeply. Part of the strands of the research into 9/11 includes, of course, the anthrax attacks of 9/11, of 2001, which a lot of people probably forget by now. But, oh, yeah, there was that whole anthrax mailing thing that happened around that same time, that happened right before the Patriot Act got passed in an overnight rush, shut down Congress for a couple days. That anthrax attack. So I have been interested in that for many years and talked about it, interviewed people about it, had podcasts about it, etc. And as part of the strands of that research, I've looked at the various parts of the infrastructure for essentially not just a homeland security state like we saw after 9/11, but a biosecurity state where they're going to be mass quarantining and forced vaccinating, et cetera, and the Health Emergency Powers Act that was passed in the wake of the anthrax attacks, and other pieces of the executive and legislative branch passing legislation, for example, to put this into place in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So I have talked and thought about this. I've been covering, for example, from the 2009 swine flu, quote unquote, pandemic, and the Zika scare in 2014, the Ebola scare, all of these different health scares that have come along. So when the dreaded COVID scourge arrived, I was, shall we say, very well prepared for what was about to happen. And so I was immediately talking about it, flashing back to some of my earlier work. Like, for example, I did a 2009 podcast on the subject of medical martial law, and basically just trying to tell people about what was happening, why it was happening, how this situation was going to be used to restrict people's rights, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, as I'm sure you know, that was one of the very, very, very big no-nos on YouTube. You couldn't talk about things like, the 2020 election being stolen, et cetera, or whatever. But of course, one of the main things that you could not talk about was anything that contradicted whatever the CDC and or the WHO were saying that particular week, because as we know, it changed from week to week.
Right.
Well, no mask, one mask, two masks, one mask. No, paper masks don't work. Yes, they do work, et cetera, whatever. We all know the absolute craziness that went on. Anyway, I was absolutely not going to self-censor or shut up or just toe a party line in order to stay on YouTube. So I did start getting the strikes and the warnings and all of those sorts of things. And it was a process of 3 strikes and you're out, essentially. And the third strike, funnily enough, actually came on a podcast I did called Science Says, which was literally about the philosophy of science. And I'm literally reading from Thomas Kuhn and talking about the structure of scientific revolutions, etc. But of course, I brought up people like Peter Hotez and the things that he was saying, that comparing COVID dissidents to nuclear terrorists and things, just absolute insane, the insanity that we've been seeing the past few years. And that was apparently the bridge too far. That was the one that nuked my main channel. I also had a backup channel that persisted, I think, for a few months. And then that one got nuked as well. But then, weirdly enough, about a year later or something like that, I woke up one morning and boop, my backup channel was back up for some reason. And didn't get any communication whatsoever from YouTube about it. Absolutely nothing. It's just suddenly there. So I said, okay, well, that's good to know. I'll leave it up simply so that my archive is there, but I'm going to put up a video just to say I am never uploading to this controlled platform ever again. If you want me, go to CorbettReport.com. And I upload to many, many, many other video platforms, just not YouTube.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was very interesting, and it's been getting worse. Are you familiar with Louis Rossmann and his work?
I can't say it rings a bell.
Okay. So he's into a lot of right to repair stuff, but he works for a organization, Fudo, which is I guess, funded by a benevolent billionaire, if we are to believe it. But the apps that I just wanted to bring up were GrayJ and Harbor and Polycentric, which allow what their goal is to try to make it so that you can follow creators regardless of the platform. So if they get banned or shadow banned, you can try to track them.
Right.
It is all open source, but of course it is controlled.
I mean, if only we had a really simple solution for that, like I don't know, really simple syndication. If only someone would come up with, oh wait, that already existed and was deliberately dismantled by the big tech giants over the last several years. And I know about that personally as well, because I used to use FeedBurner, which used to be a really great, simple, it would syndicate your RSS all over the place in very simple format so that complete noobs could just click the button and sign up for your RSS, no problem. But then Google took over FeedBurner, deliberately destroyed it, essentially. They just didn't upgrade it, didn't update it. And then eventually I get the FeedBurner has been discontinued. Wow, I wonder why big tech is so against RSS.
Right, one of the simplest ways to just, get information sent. you've seen the Canadian attempt to regulate basically, I think, I haven't looked into the details, so I'm not sure if you have, but from what what they're reporting about it, if you're a podcaster, supposedly you have to register these kinds of things. And it's very weird that the Western world is basically turning into what we were accusing, communist Russia doing in the 50s, censoring everything. No one's able to talk, all to control the narrative and prevent the spread of misinformation, which I never thought I would hear people actually seriously discussing. How do you stop misinformation? Which I thought in a free world, you just accepted that there's always going to be people that tell lies, and the way to solve that is to just get more information out there.
Well, actually, disinformation is telling lies. Misinformation is simply just being wrong.
Sure.
So now you can't even be wrong. You can't have a wrong opinion. And who gets to decide right and wrong? Oh, of course, it's the politicians and whoever's funding them in their back pocket. Yeah.
Right. And mainstream science, which I'm sure you'll agree, science is a method. It's not science is not an institute. It's not, there is no arbiter that is
right. Who is the spokesman for science?
Right.
Political appointee like
Neil deGrasse
Fauci?
Tyson.
No, I don't think so. Right.
Okay, well, are you familiar with the Canadian, I can't remember what it's called. They're trying to get something where you have to register any of your, any media, basically.
Yes, I'm aware of it. I haven't been following it closely. I know it did pass, and I haven't heard about its implementation yet. And I think the way that it is phrased is not necessarily that it's going to immediately scrub all independent podcasts off the web. But my understanding is that the first implementation of it is that any large-scale platform with however many users whatsoever, I'm not sure what the number they have embedded in the legislation is, will have to register with the government. And again, it's vague and open to legal interpretation. Okay. And I saw some people saying that it might even mean that various platforms would have to give user information to the government, presumably big platforms like Spotify, etc. But I don't know. I don't know how they're going to accomplish that. I do know that, for example, Facebook, in protest of laws that are going in that would make them essentially liable to pay news organizations to have links to those news organizations' stories on Facebook, have actually stopped posting news content whatsoever, or stopped Canadians from posting news content to Facebook, which is crazy, but just one of those things that I guess the Canadian government thinks they're going to be able to regulate this problem away. And all of this, as you say, all of this is kind of baffling if we come at it from the perspective of, well, it's just governments overreacting or something like that. But actually, when you really, really, really look at the history of this, you see that this is not just predictable, but almost a certainty that in the exact sort of period of time that we're living in, that these sorts of things would be taking place. And I say that advisedly because a couple of years ago, I put out a mini documentary called The Media Matrix, where I looked at the history of mass media from really the 15th century all the way up to today. And I really do think we are living in a sort of what I call a Gutenberg 2.0 moment with the advent of the internet. This truly is the type of revolutionary technology that we saw there in the 15th century with Gutenberg's press really, truly breaking the doors down, opening the floodgates for widespread literacy. And that isn't just about the ability of people to read books, as we tend to think of it today. Just the scale and scope of the change that took place pre-Gutenberg to post-Gutenberg is difficult for us to wrap our heads around, but some people have. For example, Elizabeth Eisenstein wrote about the printing press in early modern Europe, and started to codify and talk about the various ways that utterly, completely transformed European society, and then eventually, of course, global society. With, for example, a lot of people would say that the Reformation probably would not have occurred without the printing press. At any rate, it was certainly helped along with the printing press. The Renaissance in general was helped along by the printing press. And the sort of widespread political ramifications of that reverberated for centuries and really in substantial ways led to the overthrow of monarchies like the French Revolution, led to the American Revolution, with the printing press being a key essential part of that, with Thomas Paine and Common Sense, et cetera, et cetera. This has been such a fundamentally transformative technology that we take so completely for granted today. I think we are living through that same sort of revolution right now, today. And I think the people who know this, feel this most acutely, are the people who are in positions of power in our society, who are the most under threat by the potential for this new technology to unleash a neo-reformation, a neo-renaissance of people being able to communicate with each other in a relatively free fashion. Because, as I point out in my documentary, I think by the end of the 20th century, the oligopolistic, that's easy for me to say, practices of the media oligopoly had consolidated that control over the printing press revolution. I think that revolution had finally been put back in the bag by the fact that the technologies for widespread mass media propagation, the printing presses, more importantly, perhaps radio broadcasting, television broadcasting, satellite networks, were prohibitively expensive. No individual could own a satellite network, but a gigantic corporation could. So you had these handful of corporations that tended to control almost all mass media. The internet threatened to completely blow that up, and did I think, for a period of time. And weirdly enough, not only do we see, as I think is completely to be expected, the billionaire oligopolists and the politicians that they own are working as hard as they can to put that cat back in the bag with legislation like what we're seeing in Canada and elsewhere. But even stranger to me, is the fact that people are willingly, I think, herding themselves back into the pen of a few corporations tending to own everything. I mean, you probably know, I certainly know, a couple of decades ago online looked very, very different than it does today. And I mean that in the most literal sense. I mean, you had those crazy, everyone had their own, what was it, Angel Fire or whatever website with the crazy JavaScript twirly nonsense and weird backgrounds and what have you. But it was incredibly unique, and everyone had their own little personal space. And then what we saw was, with the advent of MySpace and then Facebook and then Twitter, and this complete big tech takeover of that space, so that everyone now is allowed a little bit of space on some big corporation's servers, essentially. And that's where your identity now rests. It's not just centralization of content, it's centralization of identity in the hands of a few big tech giants that now essentially control what is happening online. And not because they have a gun to your head saying you must have a Twitter account or what have you, but because everyone just gravitates to it. Oh, it's just easier. Everyone's there, so let's all go there. And that, to me, is kind of the most fascinating aspect of all of this.
Yeah, that is true. There was a lot of good content, and it's even scarier, though, when you look at the search engines and how it's manipulated. And I started noticing this several years ago, but now pretty much Google is worthless if you're trying to do anything decent with it. It is attempting to push you towards any paid ad. It buries any meaningful content. You have to use search aggregators or things like that to really try to find stuff that's not in any of the major systems. And then if you're looking for just general, like, technical help, for instance, just searching Reddit is actually more helpful than going to Google, because Google just shoves ads at you. Actually, I wanted to kind of talk on that. I think I mentioned to you when I was asking you for the interview time, Yanis Varoufakis, or I can't pronounce the name, but and the techno-gulag, techno-feudalism, and basically in what you're describing is people have self-selected into these pens, but the business world, the Amazon marketplace, for instance, is what his point is even in this, it's so insidious, where you're going, well, first of all, I've worked in technology for a while. So when I saw corporations, because, everyone wants to be innovative, but their idea of innovation is basically doing what everyone else does, right? So when Amazon's marketplace was taking off, all these corporations that had their own space wanted to still jump on Amazon to sell product, which I thought was a horrible idea. And as you know, the lawsuits that are, or as you may know, the lawsuits that are, monopolistic practices, where they would, if you had a popular product, they would basically steal that and then basically push you down in the search results so that they could prop their products up. But they control the whole environment, and businesses even who are supposed to know how to run their business even go towards these platforms and are completely controlled. It's not a market. It's not a free market at all. It's a completely controlled, as he says, a gulag, where they get to do what they want with whatever you're putting up there, and then you're paying them for the privilege of them controlling your destiny. It's insane, in my opinion.
And in fact, that's an interesting point, because it brings to my mind what was the marketplace online 20, 25 years ago was not Amazon, it was eBay. Once again, that represented a somewhat more horizontal playing field in which it was more peer-to-peer transactions. But Amazon came along with its corporate structure to basically consolidate and centralize that control. So now it is the central hub that everyone has to sell through. Rather than sort of auctions and people selling to each other. So absolutely, again, it actually says something, I think, extremely important about the way people are, well, I want to say fundamentally lazy, but at any rate, it is what it is. And people will go to what is sort of the easiest option. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to learn anything. I don't have to change anything that I'm doing. I just click a button and, hey, I'll get this thing. And that ultimately may be the downfall of human civilization. When you really start to think about it, because as Varoufakis, Shoshana Zuboff, others are talking about with regards to this techno-feudalism, I call it the digital gulag. What we are being led into is not just about the corporate consolidation of control in fewer and fewer hands into these gigantic, almost unimaginably massive oligopoly institutions, the big tech giants, but also on top of that, we are being led further and further into what I've called the media matrix, the digital identity, which will be the core of who and what we are as we step further and further into the metaverse, however it ultimately ends up playing out. And maybe it won't be Meta that will be controlling that, but at any rate, something along those lines, some real integration of this media technology with our day-to-day lives, whether that be virtual reality or augmented reality or various implementations of that. We will start to exist more and more in this virtual space. And who and how will that virtual avatar of yours be controlled? Well, we're starting to see the very, very, very thin edge of that very, very large wedge, with Europe just in the past couple of weeks starting to get the ball rolling on their digital EID, or whatever they're going to call it. And as was immediately pointed out by some of the MEPs, the members of European Parliament who were protesting this, they were saying, well, now that it exists, they're going to have to fill it with something. And that something's probably going to be your CBDC, your central bank digital currency, which, of course, eventually will be tied into your social credit score. Your UBI payments will hinge on whether or not you've had your 18 booster or whatever the case may be. We can all imagine the ways in which that plays out in very dystopic fashion. So we're really on the cusp of this, and it really is ultimately, I think the ultimate knife edge here is that the reason I think that they haven't gone full bore with the full-on implementation of digital ID and CBDC and all of this, it's not that the technology doesn't exist, and to some extent it's not that even the legislative infrastructure doesn't exist. It's that the public consciousness has to be prepared for this leap we're about to take, and that's really what all of this Great Reset, Fourth Industrial Revolution, all these buzzwords that the World Economic Forum has been throwing about the past several years, that's what this is really about, is getting us prepared for essentially this leap off the digital cliff that we're all about to take.
Well, yeah, I have my doubts if that's going to succeed, but what you just mentioned, digital currencies by state run, what do you think of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin specifically itself?
So as an anarchist myself, I have been gravitated to, I've been covering, I've been thinking about and talking about the cryptocurrency space since, well, documentably on the record, since 2011, I think was my first interview about Bitcoin. And so I've been in the space, I've been thinking about it, talking to people involved in it. And there's no doubt that the way that it was sold, at any rate, and the way that a lot of people perceived it in its early instantiation was this is the way around to disintermediate the banking system and to get rid of the central bank middlemen. We do not need them. Right. We can completely bypass that and have a completely different realm of monetary transaction that is truly peer-to-peer and has no middleman coming in between that can stop or regulate any kind of exchange. And that ethos if it had played out, and if people had really, really, if that had been the core of these cryptocurrency projects, I think that truly was a way forward, not the way forward, as in everyone will use crypto for every transaction in all times. That would be stupid. But at any rate, as a true alternative to the banking system as it exists, I think it genuinely has had and has potential. However, of course, what we saw when Bitcoin started rising and people started getting into it as a form of speculation, and people are coming in, how many dollars can I make out of this Bitcoin, which completely misses the point of what this technology is supposed to be about. And so now, of course, yes, they can regulate exchanges till the cows come home, because of course that is the in and out space of their controlled banking system. So of course they can control that in a million different ways. And that's the way that people are so fundamentally tuned into that mindset in terms of, I am going to buy Bitcoin with dollars and I'm going to trade them and then I'm going to get my dollars out of this. If that's your mindset, then it really is just an adjunct of the banking system. It's not actually a competitor to it. So the core idea of cryptocurrency as a peer-to-peer exchange, I think, is valuable. But so few people truly understand that, let alone actually work to create the economy that is needed to support that type of transaction. Because as I've come to learn over the years, I've been talking about monetary reform and different ways of doing this basically since the inception of the Corbett Report. And one thing that's really struck out to me is it does not matter. It doesn't matter at all how wonderful your monetary idea is, how perfect a system you come up with. If nobody's using it, it's worthless. You have to have a community that is committed to using that and developing a space for transactions in that currency before that currency has any meaning or relevance or value. And unfortunately, the truly crypto, truly peer-to-peer economy of not caring what the dollar value of a Bitcoin is, but exchanging Bitcoin directly or whatever, Monero or whatever your coin of choice is, that economy has not developed. And without that, it's a great idea. It doesn't mean anything.
Right. And the first world had less need for a currency. The unbanked, more in the third world, did or still does use it a little bit more like what it was meant to be. But yeah, I've gotten into many arguments with people that talk about the uselessness of crypto and all this stuff, but they're always thinking about it from an investment perspective, and that's really not what the point of it was. You mentioned the laziness of businesses and people and all this stuff, but that's kind of in my limited history on Earth, I guess, it seems to be a reversal of what the business world used to be. The big tycoons in the past worked hard to basically attempt to develop as much stuff, it seemed like, in-house as possible. But now almost everyone wants to just pay someone else to do something so that they can do the most basic minimal amount of effort. And I don't know where that comes from, but that seems to be what I see as a shift in our whole, just like we put all of our manufacturing over to China. Carol Quigley and I think you covered this. They were shipping factories to Russia before the war. It's I don't know where that comes from, unless I was listening to one of your other shows and it seemed, you were talking about the 3D chess game, unless this is just all part of their big, we're going to build this country up in this era and we're going to then tear it down and bring it over somewhere else. I don't know if that's what you think is going on here. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I guess, it depends on what level of this game we're going to look at it from. And there is the two-dimensional level of nation state versus nation state and national interests. And I think most people, most of the time, are operating within that plane. And so that does help to describe and understand events up to a certain limit. But then you get to other aspects of this where you do look at the bigger picture, and the fact that China, as this great economic juggernaut, didn't just arise spontaneously from the winds of the Gobi Desert or something. No, it has been built up through an economic and business and banking infrastructure that has been laid over the course of the past half century, demonstrably so. And we can look at how that happened and the capitalist rotors that came in under Deng Xiaoping, and the deals that were cut between China and specifically Rockefeller, leading a sort of banking conglomerate, which laid the banking infrastructure for what was then an influx of R&D and a tech investment in China in the 90s. There was a lot of R&D centers and Asian headquarters and things that were being placed in China by basically the entire Fortune 500 in the 1990s, which was odd because certainly at that time, China was not the economic rising dragon that it is perceived as today. But part of those deals cut with the Chinese government, of course, always involved technology transfer. Anything that's developed on our soil, we're going to get a hold of. And lo and behold, fast forward a few decades, and now, isn't it strange that basically all of this Chinese military gear, which is so advanced and so awesome, is in very, very many cases almost a direct copy of American military infrastructure. How on earth did all of this happen?
Right.
But that also extends to the economic realm, where there has been a deliberate and it's not like it's happened by happenstance or surprise. There's been a deliberate offshoring of productive manufacturing capability to China in the past few decades. And wow, now they're a big economic juggernaut. Who could have predicted it? So I certainly do think there is a 3D level to this, in which nation states are not the fundamental way that I think people in true positions of power, the true billionaire slash trillionaire class, question mark. I certainly don't believe the rich list of, Elon Musk is the richest man on earth. So says Forbes. But at any rate, the true ruling power, I think, is not wedded to a particular nation state per se. It is wedded to power. And the question is how best to wield that in any given era of society. And I think we're certainly, I think it's palpable now, we are undergoing a change in certainly the American unipolar world that we have grown up in our lives, at any rate. That is certainly undergoing change right now. And the question is it all just a bunch of willy-nilly, who knows, it's like a pinball game, things just bouncing around just randomly? Or do you think people in positions of power with massive amounts of wealth and political capital are not trying to invest that wealth and political capital in ways that will benefit them in the long run? I tend to think it's the latter, but I get called a crazy conspiracy theorist talking about that.
Well, yeah. So in the conspiracy world, I call it, there's the grand unified conspiracy theorist, which I personally do not subscribe to. And that is, and I'm just going to define, I'm just making up these terms myself, but that is the view that every single thing that happened is completely planned. There are no surprises. The whoever's ruling the world knows exactly what they're doing, and the pieces are moved, and this is how it goes. And, World War II, et cetera. I fall not that far, but I do think like even Quigley was saying, there was a cabal of people. He was all right with it. He just thought, this is the way it is. And they attempt to do things. It sometimes backfires. I think personally, Hitler went to, Hitler was definitely controlled by someone, but then I personally believe it got out of hand, got out of their control. Some would say that everything that happened was in their control, but what I would pose to you, and I don't know how far you've developed your theory on how these people operate, but some would say, even if they're looking at or trying to look at the 3D, okay, you've got this group of people. They want to move manufacturing and everything because, it's cheaper over there. They want to make more money. They also want to demoralize the Americans. Maybe they're too uppity. The 60s, et cetera, got too much out of hand. They're going to show them who's boss, a little more poverty, et cetera. That might bring things back later. But China, Russia, wherever, these people, these countries, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be able to maintain the iron fist on them. They might get decapitated. They might get, arrested. Why take the chance to do such an extreme shift where they could have instead gone to a South American country they had more control over or something like that? I don't know what your thoughts are on those kinds of theories.
Well, I think there are a number of factors that go into something like this, and one is just historical linkages, some of which may be surprising to people. People may or may not know that the Rockefeller family, for example, has been heavily invested in China for over a century now, has been invested in and developing institutional relations with China for a very, very long time, for generations at this point. So, I mean, that's one example that you could point to. It wasn't David Rockefeller. Well, in fact, people say it was Nixon that built the bridge to China, but actually it was Kissinger who went in a secret meeting the year before to basically work everything out before Nixon dared that rapprochement. And who was Kissinger literally working for at that time? It was David Rockefeller. But it wasn't even David Rockefeller that was really doing this. I mean, his father, John D. Jr., at the very least, was actively involved in China, setting up medical institutions and other such things over there. So there's a long history there. But how about the fact that Mao was a Yalie? I think a lot of people don't know that Mao Zedong was actually running a student newspaper on Yale in China that was literally before he even was involved in the revolution or what have you, basically pushing communist Chinese in the literal Yale in China student rag. He was the editor of. I mean, just craziness like that there's some interesting historical linkages that go back a long time. But I think the real point of this is, as I say, I think it is people understand that the various power players in any given transaction are going to be motivated by money. But when you really step back and you realize that the banking system itself is founded, for example, on the central banks, which are, I won't say printing money out of nothing. Generally, they're printing money out of people's promise to pay them back with their labor over periods of decades, when we look at the mortgage traps and other things that people fall into. But at any rate, the money that they print up is just largely a fiction that we all believe in and thus has value.
Right.
But from that perspective, I mean, after your first few billion or few tens of billions or hundreds of billions or however much you've accrued, do you think that money is the key motivating factor for these individuals? I would say not. No, it's not money. It's what money is the points on the scoreboard, but the game is for power and control. And I think once we start to put it in that perspective, you start to see how, again, people's ability to understand what is happening here is limited by the sort of ideological framework that we have. So people think it's about nation state versus nation state, or at best they think it's about ideology like capitalism versus communism, but not really. I think it's about just different ways of managing essentially the tax cattle that from the larger perspective, we all are. We're just tax cattle on this or that plantation. How best to manage them, how best to keep them in line. And there are various governing ideologies behind that, one of which is, I think, truly interesting and truly informative in a way that the sort of the capitalism, communism, or other sorts of ideologies that we're given is not so informative, is technocracy, which is a political / economic idea that was developed in the 1920s, 1930s, that had a genuine political movement in America and in Canada, and had global ambitions. But the actual historical technocracy movement it still actually exists, but there's very, very few card-carrying members at this point. But the concept of technocracy, I think, is a governing concept that is being actively pursued and helps to explain, for example, some of the interest in China. China fundamentally is not communist, or at least not in any sort of Marxist sense, maybe in some kind of Maoist sense, but even then, it's not really communist in that sense. It is a technocracy, it's technocratic, and by which people can understand that on a number of levels. One way in which that term is used is simply to mean rule by technocrats, by people of technical efficiency or proficiency, scientists and engineers and economists and what have you. But that isn't, I think, the fundamental concept of technocracy. Technocracy is a social / political / economic organization. And in its original formulation, which was worked on by a charlatan named Howard Scott and someone named M. King Hubbert, who you might know from Hubbert's Peak, a.k.a. Peak Oil. He was a petroleum geologist, but he was the co-founder of Technocracy Inc., which is what the political movement was in the 1930s. But their idea was essentially for a resource-based economy. Money, that's a stupid, outdated concept. No, what we need to do is we need the technocrats to become the rulers, essentially, of the technate, not countries. It's going to be a technate. And they will be able to perfectly calculate, because, of course, in the 1930s, everyone is concerned about the Depression and the rise of fascism and communism and all this craziness going on. People are looking for some stability. And what is causing this? Oh, the complete failure of capitalism, the big boom-bust cycle. We're in the final end of capitalism here. We need some sort of stability. So the technocratic solution was, we're going to have the technocrats, the engineers, scientists, economists, perfectly calculate exactly how much energy we need to produce in order to produce all of the goods that we need in our economy. And once we perfectly balance the energy inputs and outputs and get all of that smoothed out, there will be no more boom bust. It will be a perfectly ordered society, and we'll eliminate all this craziness that you're seeing. And of course, you can see how that would be appealing to people in the turmoil of the 1930s. But at any rate, that fundamental concept remains. And what part of their idea was, we're going to get rid of this money idea, and we're going to replace it with energy credits. Because, again, the technocrats will be able to calculate exactly how much energy we need. And they will be able to then take that energy, however many megajoules or whatever it is that will be required for our economy to function, and they will divvy it up amongst the population. And everyone will get a monthly, weekly, who knows, stipend from the government in the form of energy credits. And you will use those energy credits to go and buy goods. And goods will be measured in terms of the energy it takes to produce them, etc. And that was the solution going forward. And what are we starting to see right now is all of the pieces of that sort of crazy idea. I mean, it's hard to even imagine how crazy an idea that was in the 1930s, because it involved tabulating everything being bought and sold in the economy in real time, making all these calculations in some sort of centralized way, and managing all of this. Back in the 1930s, that was absolute pie-in-the-sky lunacy. In 2023, hey, that's kind of possible. We could do that. We certainly have the computing power to be able to keep track of every transaction. If only we could make sure it was all digital and we could, we control it all perfectly. And where have I heard of this idea of, the government issuing weekly or monthly checks? Oh, the UBI, which of course could be tied into a social credit. And maybe it won't be in the form of dollars. Maybe we'll have carbon credits and carbon rationing in the future. Maybe this idea is coming from someplace. And when we put in that perspective, we start to see that China is a technocracy in action. It is a technate that is ruled by this clique of would-be economists, etc. People like Li Keqiang, vice premier, who at one point many years ago, when I believe, I can't remember which position he was occupying in the CCP hierarchy at that time, but he admitted privately to I can't remember it was leaked in the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables, but he admitted privately, do not trust the Chinese GDP numbers. They're pie in the sky fantasy nonsense. No, if you really want to calculate our economic productivity, you've got to look at freight shipping volume and this energy production, blah, blah, blah. And he had all the numbers of what you really need to understand. But they are essentially trying to order and manage an economy from a technocratic perspective. And I think that is what appeals to the technocrats in America and England and France and everywhere else, as evidenced, for example, by David Rockefeller's ode to Mao upon his death, that was published in the New York Times, I believe 1973, from a China traveler, and in which Rockefeller praised Mao's great leap forward as the greatest social experiment that's ever taken place. Well, what kind of social experiment was that exactly? It was essentially the crucible towards forming a more perfectly controlled society. And so isn't it interesting? And this is what I want people to really consciously keep in mind as they go forward from here. Isn't it interesting? Of course, we hate those Chi-Coms. They're the enemy. We're against them. And look at the horrible things that they do to their population. But wouldn't it be nice if we could do that to our population? And you are already seeing that type of interesting reverse propaganda in a way. You're going to see more of it in the future. And I definitely saw it in the past few years with oh my God, look at what China is doing, literally boarding people in their apartments so that they can't leave, and all of this digital infrastructure for you can't get past your, the end of your street because you need your QR code. And all of this starts to be implemented in the West because, hey, actually, it seems to be working. This is a great way of. So it's a very strange thing that doesn't make sense from sort of the 2D nation state level. But when you start to look at it as these are various, essentially, cattle herders who are trying to more effectively manage their tax cattle, once we put it in that framework, we start to see, they're swapping ideas at the top level, at the very least, if not actively forwarding these systems of control in various countries as essentially social experiments, like what David Rockefeller praised.
Well, okay, and I can go along with some of that, but the couple things are, well, one, I don't think personally it's going to work. I think at some point the people are going to have enough, at least in the Western world. But second, where do you think the actual people that are in control are, and what prevents some, rowdy government taking control and really just putting them in their place?
Well, I agree with you fundamentally that this is not the grand unified conspiracy theory that every single there is one smoky room and every person gets a script and they have to follow that script. That's comic book nonsense. It does not work that way, and I would never suggest that. I think there are competing factions and cliques, even amongst the power hierarchy. Clearly, we've had a demonstration over the past few years that it is not national governments that are in total control. They are receiving marching orders from World Health Organization or World Economic Forum or these institutions and bodies that you barely even hear about and don't know much about. But suddenly they start, if not dictating, certainly not directly dictating, but they set these guidelines and policies on international frameworks and regulations, and national governments just go along with them. And they all seem to go along around the same time with the same sorts of ideas. So you get the Netherlands and Canada and Sri Lanka and all of these completely unrelated governments starting to pass the same sorts of restrictions on nitrogen and farming and things like this. Oh, it's just because we're in accord with the UNFCCC and we're part of the Conference of the Parties that is governing that framework convention, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting how that works. But as I say, I think there are competing factions and cliques, and people are, I'm sure, stabbing each other in the back all the time and vying for control, even amongst the upper echelons of this power hierarchy. I think and so that certainly does mean that there's nothing to guarantee that any given country or any particular political leader couldn't, quote unquote, go rogue and start doing something that isn't part of, quote unquote, the plan. But I think the fundamental defining principle of all of this generally tends to be money. And when we look historically, we can see the ways that financing has been the key to essentially any sort of ultimate political authority. And we can see that from the inception of central banking back hundreds of years ago, which came into existence, certainly, for example, in the Bank of England context, as a way of funding the king's ability to fight France in wars. He couldn't fund it anymore, so he created the Bank of England, which granted them a charter, which allowed these bankers, putting up very little capital, to mint the coin of the realm, and then to lend that to the king, which is a great gig if you can get it. And I think essentially it has worked that way ever since. So fundamentally, this comes back down to the monetary power, and I think that's where we have to understand where the fundamental power lies. And as you alluded to earlier, I think people like Hitler and others certainly don't just spontaneously arise and do everything for themselves. No, they are funded. And taking a look at the Reichsbank and how that played into the international financial infrastructure of the 20s and 30s, leading up to World War II, the economic side of all of that, I think, is incredibly important and often neglected when it comes to looking at world events like that. And I think similarly, we could see, if, for example, a Xi Jinping was completely off script and was truly a fundamental threat and menace to this not any particular nation state, but the fundamental global system of control, I think he could be adequately contained pretty quickly with regards to the monetary cutting off of that financial infrastructure, which creates, for example, here's a great example of that. So we have seen SWIFT become a sort of thing that the average person at least may have heard of, the SWIFT banking network, which is the international system for banks to send money to across borders, essentially. How do banks talk to each other across borders, et cetera? There is a SWIFT network which communicates these transactions in a standardized way so that banks around the world can hook into this network and basically settle across borders. Okay, great. So that's part of the settlement mechanism that banks use to allow international trade. And it's always been this, it's a private entity. It has nothing to do with politics. It's not political in any way. Until, 2011, 2012, when the U.S. basically pressured SWIFT to delist Iran and various Iranian banks, and they did. So, of course, it is a political entity, of course. And we've certainly seen the threats coming for Russia and China, et cetera. And, of course, after the Ukraine invasion, we saw various Russian banks getting delisted from SWIFT. But don't worry, guys, because China's been working on this for years. They've got their own CIPS, China Interbank Payment System, I believe, which they've been working on for years, this infrastructure for subverting this system of Western economic control. Don't worry, guys, we've got it. But asterisk, read the very small fine print. The CIPS network, at least from its inception, literally runs on the SWIFT network. They lease space on the SWIFT network in order to make their transaction information flow. So, I mean, whoa, there's your big runaround. At any rate, fundamentally, I think this comes down to a sort of that's the ultimate control mechanism here is the monetary financial space of this. And so I think that's where we at least would more fruitfully look if we were looking for who's at the top of this hierarchy. But as I say, I don't think it's a single plan by a single person or a single group that controls everything.
Sure. Yeah, and I didn't mean to infer that you thought that. Just whenever the topic of conspiracies, I know that there's some people that think that. Now, I personally think the attempt of America and the other, Western powers to weaponize the monetary system, I think, is actually leading to us losing a lot of control in things. I mean, we're basically, and again, maybe this is on the 2D chessboard instead of the 3D, but it seems like we're basically a laughingstock now. We can slam our fist, we can bomb a bunch of stuff, but no one really pays attention to anything we actually want anymore unless we start dropping bombs. We've kind of lost a lot of that clout that we used to have from, after World War II, basically. From what I'm seeing.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think we have to position this in its historical context. So one of the end results of World War I was the League of Nations, which we saw function for a while and sort of fall apart. It never ultimately got ratified by the U.S. and it didn't function the way it was supposed to, and ultimately became a laughingstock and fell apart with Japan and others basically flouting it in the 1930s, and obviously didn't prevent World War II. So we got to do something better this time, guys. And so the result of World War II was the United Nations, which actually came out of planning meetings that were taking place in the Council on Foreign Relations as an advisory body to the U.S. government in the course of the war. I think they started in 41, 42. At any rate, I will have much more to say about that in future documentaries I'm working on. But at any rate, the United Nations, ultimately end result of World War II, and has functioned for decades as this quasi, not really global governmental body, but certainly global institutions of various sorts, from, for example, that aforementioned UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to the World Health Organization, to all sorts of treaties, conventions, regulations. And as I wrote about very recently on CorbettReport.com, I had an analysis of the Conference of the Parties mechanism as a type of quasi-global governmental system of control on various jurisdictions. And for people who don't know about this, these various framework conventions, agreements, treaties, etc., generally have a conference of the parties, so-called, which is everyone who is party signature to this agreement will come together on a yearly basis or whatever they decide, and will essentially set rules or regulations or limits, or how can people be living up to this? So, of course, we're about to see COP28 taking place, I believe is it Dubai, where they're about to descend with their annual conclave to talk about how they're, going to limit meat eating in order to save the world, or whatever garbage nonsense they're going to shove down our throat or take out of our throat anyway. But anyway, that is this whole infrastructure for this quasi-global governmental mechanism. And as I say, it's never that the World Health Organization says something and then every country is thereby legally mandated to do it necessarily right away. But at any rate, given, say, the international health regulations that exist, help to explain why, when the WHO declares a PHEIC, a public health emergency of international concern, which is part of this international health regulations, which every single WHO signatory is party to, which is basically every nation on Earth, it might explain why, when the WHO starts giving these various recommendations and guidelines, that every single national government's authority, the CDC in the US, for example, falls into line and lockstep with it, and starts shutting down and locking down and masking and all of these other things. How does this happen? There is no global government. There's just these agreements and these various bodies that have been set up. Anyway, the point is, World War I, League of Nations, it didn't really work. World War II, United Nations, well, it kind of works. World War III, can you imagine what body will be set up in the wake of that? And when we start thinking of it in those terms, I think that puts into perspective what we have seen over the course of the past 20 years. Again, if we can get out of the mindset that the people in positions of power and authority are solely and simply interested in the United States of America and its ability to wield its might on the global stage. If there was, for example, the sense that, hey, maybe we could have a type of conflict which resulted in a global government with actual teeth this time, then there may be a more long-term strategy to essentially deplete the United States. The next world order cannot form until the current world order is destroyed. So what better way to form a new world order than to destroy the current world order? And what better way to do that than to lead people along with the, hey, this is in America's interest. That's why we're going into Afghanistan. That's why we're going into Iraq. That's why we're dropping bombs on Syria. That's why we're getting involved in this proxy war with Russia. That's why we're literally, $6 billion extra to Ukraine. Oops, we didn't even mean to do that, but you can have it anyways. Whereas people in Lahaina, too bad for you. You get $700 and, so long, good luck.
Exactly.
That kind of maneuver does not make sense if the people in charge truly care about America first. They do not. So what do they care about? They care about power. They care about control.
Yes. I think you're onto something there. We have covered a lot of topics. I didn't even get into talking about how we don't even, as a nation, don't even seem to be able to do almost anything. We're pretty much paralyzed by our ineffective governance and everything else that's going on, and other nations that are up and coming are way more agile, etc. But I know we're coming up to the top of the hour here, or the bottom, whichever way you look at it. Any last thoughts that you wanted to cover real quick? I know we covered a lot of topics.
We covered an awful lot, and as you say, we barely scraped the surface. Anyway, I have been talking about this stuff for 16 years now. There are literally thousands and thousands of hours of media on CorbettReport.com, completely 100% totally for free. So if people in your audience haven't heard it before, I hope they'll check it out. It is meant as a resource, and I have tried to document. I try my level best to document what I'm saying. I don't talk out of my posterior, or at least when I do, I try to make it clear that I'm talking out of my posterior and speculating. But I have a lot of information there with a lot of, and I always try to hyperlink all of my sources. That has been the key part of the Corbett Report. It's tagline open source intelligence news. Since day one, that's been the tagline of the website. So at any rate, it's all there at CorbettReport.com. I hope people check it out.
Definitely. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was James Corbett of the Corbett Report. Remember, check out his show at CorbettReport.com. And as always, as the chimes tell us, remember to keep packing those bolts. Until next time, see ya.
real goat.